I stood there, my hands shaking, staring at the toilet lid in front of me, the tin of dog food at its center, a cruel mockery of the years I'd spent giving. My daughter and her husband laughed, their words dripping with sarcasm, but their laughter turned to silence as the weight of their actions hit. They thought I was weak. They thought I wouldn't fight back. But as the door slammed behind me, I made a promise to myself. I'd flush their future right out of their hands, one account at a time. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The dining room in Tracy and Ben Meyer's two-story suburban home tried hard to impress. An oversized crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting warm golden light over a table set with polished silverware and gleaming wine glasses. A faint vanilla scent from an expensive candle lingered in the air, carefully curated to signal class and taste. But none of it could disguise the quiet malice sitting at the head of the table. Caroline Myers stood there for a long moment, uncertain whether to laugh or gasp. Her place setting was not at the table like everyone else's. No high-back chair, no porcelain plate, or folded napkin. Instead, placed at the far end of the room, a toilet lid, detached from any plumbing, rested atop an overturned storage crate. At its center, a tin of unbranded dog food sat exposed, upturned in a perfect brown cylinder on a paper towel. She stared at it. Ben leaned back in his chair, already filming with his phone. "Come on, Caroline," he said between chuckles. "It's gourmet. Aged, kibble?" Tracy, sipping from a crystal wine glass, didn't even bother to hide her smirk. "We figured it suits her," she said casually. "It matches her class." She didn't make eye contact, choosing instead to twist the stem of her glass between two fingers, as though the joke were harmless, even elegant. The others at the table, Ben's brother and his wife, visiting for the weekend, let out uncomfortable laughs, unsure whether to play along or recoil. Tracy's house, her wine, her rules. Caroline said nothing. She hadn't spoken much all evening. She had come wearing a modest navy blue blouse and a strand of pearls she hadn't taken out since her husband Harold's funeral. She looked out of place amid the opulence her daughter liked to drape herself in like armor. Ben panned his phone camera toward her, narrating in a mock documentary tone. Here we see the matriarch in her natural setting, returning to her roots. At that, Megan, Caroline's 18-year-old granddaughter, froze. She had tried all night to keep her head down and avoid triggering one of her mother's moods, but this was too far. She stared at the dog food, then at the crude plastic seat. "This isn't funny," she muttered. Tracy's expression soured instantly. "It's a joke. Grow up." "It's not a joke if no one's laughing," Megan shot back. She looked to her grandmother. "You don't deserve this." Caroline still hadn't moved. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but her spine was straight, her chin slightly lifted. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, first to Tracy, then to Ben, then to the guests, who avoided her gaze. Finally, her eyes landed on Megan's. In them, she saw something still uncorrupted, a thread of loyalty, of shared understanding. She exhaled softly. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was calm and dry. "Is this supposed to be clever?" Ben laughed. "Come on, lighten up. It's a family dinner. Let's not make this a thing." "You made it a thing," Caroline said, her words like marble, cold, smooth, and heavy. "You just didn't expect the weight of it." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away from the table. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor as she exited the dining room, her silhouette framed for a moment by the hallway's warm amber light before disappearing altogether. Tracy raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Well, that was dramatic." Ben lowered his phone, disappointed. "She didn't even touch it. We could have gone viral." "Who cares?" Tracy muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. "She's lucky we let her stay here at all." But Megan was already rising from the table, her face pale and jaw tight. She didn't speak. She followed the sound of Caroline's fading footsteps toward the front door, where she found her grandmother standing in silence beneath the porch light. Caroline didn't look angry. She looked composed, like someone who had come to the end of a long equation and finally solved it. "They think I'm fragile," she said, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the driveway. "That I've forgotten how things work. But I haven't." Megan hesitated. "What are you going to do?" Caroline turned, gave her granddaughter the faintest smile, and gently took Megan's hand. "I'm going to remind them." Later that night, in the quiet of her old friend Ruth Daniels' living room, Caroline sat with a mug of untouched tea and a manila folder resting heavily in her lap. Ruth, perched opposite her in an armchair covered with crocheted throws, watched carefully. "They served you dog food," Ruth said flatly. "On a toilet lid." "Jesus." Caroline opened the folder and slid the first page forward. A lean document, followed by a stack of co-signed mortgages, each one carrying her signature. Each one still legally active. "They don't know," Caroline said softly, "that they built their entire life on my credit." Ruth picked up a page, scanned the numbers, then looked up with wide, startled eyes. "Well," she said slowly, a grin forming, "then let's start flushing." The following morning, Houston was already blistering. Sunlight pressed down through the blinds in harsh white slats as Caroline sat at Ruth's dining table, a small, sturdy oak piece worn down at the corners. A ceramic bowl of strawberries sat between them, untouched. Neither woman was in the mood for sweetness. The manila folder was now spread open across the table, papers fanned out like a post-mortem. Caroline had organized them chronologically: loan origination forms, refinancing agreements, home equity withdrawals. A careful web of paperwork stretching back almost a decade. Ruth leaned over one page, squinting through her bifocals. "They leveraged your name for a second property? Without telling you?" Caroline nodded, not looking up. "And a boat. A small one. But it's there. Loans tied to a checking account I forgot I even had." Ruth gave a low whistle, her tone somewhere between admiration and horror. "They turned you into a bank they didn't think would ever call in the debt. They never imagined I'd check. But you kept everything." "I always do." Caroline's fingers moved deliberately, sorting one stack into another, first by asset, then by liability. She wasn't emotional now. That part had already burned off the night before. What remained was calculation, precision. The old banker in her rising to the surface like an oil slick. Megan, still in her sleep shirt and flannel pants, padded softly into the room. She had slept in Ruth's guest bedroom after refusing to return to her parents' house. Now she stood near the table, watching her grandmother as if seeing her for the first time. "What is all this?" she asked quietly. Caroline looked up, offering a faint smile. "This is how they paid for their house, their cars, their vacations. With my name." Megan stepped closer, eyes scanning the documents. "Wait, all of this is in your name?" "I'm the co-signer," Caroline said. "In some cases, the lien holder. On paper, I help them qualify. In practice, I own the foundation of their entire lifestyle." Megan sat down slowly. "So, technically," Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Technically, I own their future." Megan blinked, and then grinned, sharp and satisfied. "Holy shit." Ruth smirked from across the table, tapping one manicured finger against a promissory note. "Flush them clean." Caroline reached for her phone and scrolled through contacts until she found the name: Alan Pierce. She hadn't spoken to him in over 4 years, but she remembered every conversation like it had happened yesterday. Alan was one of the few attorneys in Houston who understood both the legal nuances of estate structure and the art of quiet revenge. She pressed call. 2 rings, then a voice, gravelly but measured. "Pierce. It's Caroline Myers." A pause. "Well, well, to what do I owe the honor?" "I need to make a few things inconvenient for my daughter and her husband." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "How inconvenient are we talking?" "I want their lines of credit examined. Joint accounts frozen. Liens reevaluated. Everything they used me for. I want it back in my hands or out of theirs. She could hear Alan's smirk through the phone. That's aggressive. It's overdue. Well, he said, voice turning cool and professional. We'd need to verify the loan structures, check what can be recalled. I assume you have documents? Every one of them. Then yes, he said. We can choke their accounts until they can't breathe. Caroline hung up without saying goodbye. She didn't need to. Alan understood the language of leverage. She stood and began gathering the papers back into the folder, her motions swift and confident now. Megan watched her, awe blooming behind her tired eyes. I didn't know you could do all this, Megan said. I haven't done anything yet, Caroline replied, slipping the last document into place. I just reminded myself that I can. Late Friday morning in their manicured Houston subdivision, the sound of a car door slamming broke the stillness. Birds scattered from the oak branches lining the street as a black and white Ford Explorer pulled up to the curb of the Myers' pristine driveway. A uniformed deputy stepped out, clipboard tucked under one arm, folded legal envelope in hand. His boots were polished. His expression wasn't friendly. From across the street, Caroline watched from inside Ruth's parked sedan. The windows were tinted just enough to keep her hidden. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. Just sat still and watched the slow march of justice begin. Here we go, Ruth murmured beside her, sipping iced coffee with one hand, phone angled to record with the other. Right on schedule. The deputy climbed the front steps of Tracy and Ben's stone-trimmed colonial. The door had a garland still hanging from Easter, even though it was August. He knocked twice, then peeled back a strip of blue tape and firmly pressed the envelope against the glass pane beside the doorknob. The bright orange header at the top was unmistakable: legal notice of default and intent to enforce lien. Neighbors began to emerge. It didn't take long. The woman walking her beagle paused near the edge of the driveway. 2 kids on bikes stopped mid-pedal. The man watering his lawn across the street turned the hose off but kept staring. Inside the house, movement stirred. Then the door flung open. Tracy Myers stepped onto the porch barefoot, holding a half-empty coffee mug. Her silk robe flapped against her legs in the breeze. Her eyes scanned the taped notice, and for a second, she didn't seem to understand what she was reading. Then she did. "What the hell is this?" she snapped. The deputy didn't answer. His duty ended the moment the paper touched the door. Ben appeared behind her, shirtless, yawning. "What's going on?" His voice trailed off as his eyes landed on the bright orange sticker. "What the hell?" Tracy repeated, louder now. "You can't do this. This is harassment. We haven't done anything wrong." Her voice cracked at the edge. Megan, standing just inside the foyer with her phone already rolling, quietly stepped out onto the porch. Her arms were crossed, face unreadable. "Are you filming me?" Tracy hissed. "You said we need to document everything when people try to screw us," Megan said, tone flat. "I'm just taking your advice." Ben stepped forward, ripping the notice off the door. "Who sent this?" The deputy, now halfway down the walkway, called over his shoulder. "Contact is listed on the second page. Attorney of record. Myers' residence has 15 days to respond or vacate." "Vacate!" Tracy shrieked, clutching her robe closed. "This is my house." "It's in her name," came a voice from the sidewalk. All heads turned. Caroline stood beside Ruth now, calm and composed in a navy pantsuit and low heels. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She hadn't raised her voice, but it cut through the air like a gavel. Tracy's face collapsed inward. You wouldn't dare." "I already did." Tracy stepped off the porch, practically vibrating. "You've lost your mind. This is elder abuse. This is illegal." Ben turned red, fumbling for his phone, but Megan was already filming the entire scene from her angle, capturing her mother's unraveling with surgical precision. "You think this makes you powerful?" Tracy spit the words like venom. "You're just a bitter old woman who can't stand seeing her daughter succeed." Caroline tilted her head slightly. If success means using someone else's signature to buy a life you can't afford, then yes, I have a problem with it. Ruth leaned in toward her. That's the first flush, she whispered, just loud enough for Tracy to hear. The blood drained from Tracy's face. Ben finally broke his silence. We'll sue you, for every dime. You'll regret this. No, Caroline said calmly. You will. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and anxiety. Cold air poured from the ceiling vents, humming against the hush that filled the space as people settled into the wooden pews. It was an early Monday morning docket, but the case name still caught more than a few eyes on the bulletin board outside. Ben and Tracy Myers versus Caroline Myers. Petition for conservatorship on grounds of mental incompetence. Caroline sat calmly at the defendant's table, dressed in a charcoal blazer and a silk blouse the color of oxblood. Her hands were folded, her expression composed. At her side sat Alan Pierce, crisp and immovable, like a man preparing for a checkmate. Across from them, Ben adjusted his tie with trembling fingers, while Tracy whispered furiously into his ear. She was wearing a dove-gray dress that looked expensive but too tight around the arms, as if her confidence was tailored a size too small. The bailiff called the court to order. A hush rippled through the room as Judge Rowe entered. Stern, silver-haired, known for hating theatrics and despising entitlement. His reputation preceded him like a loaded gavel. Ben stood. Your Honor, I respectfully submit that Caroline Myers, my mother-in-law, is no longer mentally competent to manage her financial affairs. Her recent behavior has been erratic, vindictive, and damaging to our family. We believe she is being manipulated, possibly by third parties, and we're asking the court to grant temporary conservatorship so that her assets may be preserved. Judge Rowe blinked once, slowly. Do you have medical evidence of mental decline? Ben glanced at the papers in front of him, suddenly unsure. We have, statements. Character witnesses. Her behavior has become increasingly unpredictable. I'm asking for documentation, not gossip. Tracy stood next. She's unstable, Your Honor. She had a tantrum at a family dinner. She's harassing us through legal threats. She's clearly confused. Judge Rowe turned his attention to the defense table. Ms. Myers, he said, his voice deep and measured. Do you wish to speak for yourself? Caroline rose slowly, every motion deliberate. She didn't need to glance at notes. There were none. Your Honor, I spent 38 years working in banking and investment risk. I managed portfolios larger than my son-in-law's annual salary. I filed every legal form involved in my family's finances. I co-signed loans. I hold liens. I know exactly what I'm doing. Rowe narrowed his eyes slightly. And are you aware your family is contesting your mental capacity? I'm aware, she said evenly. I'm also aware that contesting competence is a convenient way to silence someone whose money you've already spent. A quiet murmur ran through the gallery. Judge Rowe banged his gavel once. Mr. Pierce, your documents? Alan stood, smooth as silk, and handed a thick folder to the clerk. Included are original loan agreements, mortgage schedules, bank statements, and property titles, all legally executed with my client's name. You'll also find emails and notarized letters confirming that Mr. and Mrs. Myers repeatedly used my client's credit history and financial backing without ever relinquishing her position as lien holder. Rowe flipped through the folder briefly, his eyebrows arching slightly. I see. And this was never disclosed in any attempt to transfer ownership? No, Your Honor, Alan said. My client retained all controlling interest. Their lifestyle was built on her paper. She merely chose not to remind them. The judge looked up. Is that true, Mr. Myers? Ben stammered. I mean, she said she wanted to help us. Help you, Rowe interrupted. Isn't the same as gifting you legal ownership of 6 figures worth of assets. Sit down. Tracy's face turned bone white. Megan, seated 2 rows behind Caroline, pulled out her phone but didn't record. She didn't need to. This moment was for memory, not social media. Judge Rowe leaned forward. I find no evidence of mental incompetence. I do, however, see ample documentation of financial misrepresentation on your part. He pointed at Ben. This is a court of law, not a family therapist's office. Petition denied. Gavel. One clean bang. Tracy let out a strangled sob. 2 days after the court hearing, the Houston air was thick with humidity and consequence. While the Myers household sulked behind closed blinds, Caroline sat in the corner office of a quiet downtown credit union, her hands resting neatly on the leather edge of the banker's desk. Across from her, the manager, mid-40s, polite but slightly anxious, scanned a screen while tapping a few keys. So you'd like to freeze access to all joint accounts tied to these lines? He asked cautiously. I'm not closing them, Caroline clarified. Just freezing all activity until my legal team finishes a deeper audit. That includes debit, credit, transfers, wire authorizations, and mobile banking. The man hesitated. That'll immediately lock the cards. I know. He typed another command. I'll need your signature here. And here. She signed both lines in smooth, practiced strokes. The same hand that once approved million-dollar commercial loans now flicked her initials over the future of her ungrateful daughter and parasitic son-in-law, like it was routine paperwork. Once complete, she stood, adjusted the collar of her silk blouse, and smiled politely. Have a good day? The banker swallowed. You too, Mrs. Myers. Across town, in the produce aisle of a high-end grocery store, Tracy swiped her Amex with the same carelessness she'd always used, one eye on her phone, the other on a cart full of overpriced organic nonsense. Declined. She frowned, looked down at the terminal and tried again. Declined. Ben, trailing behind her with a bag of pistachios and a bottle of artisanal olive oil, raised an eyebrow. Try mine. She snatched it out of his hand like it was a grenade. Declined. The cashier, a bored teenager with purple hair and AirPods in one ear, didn't even blink. Want me to hold this while you call the bank? Tracy's face turned blotchy. There must be a mistake. Try the Visa. Declined. People behind them in line were starting to notice. A middle-aged woman with a toddler whispered to her husband, who tried not to stare but failed. Ben leaned in. Something's wrong. This is all wrong. Megan, watching from the far end of the checkout lane with her phone discreetly angled upward, captured it all. The tension, the panic, the fragile mask cracking in real time. Outside the store, Tracy exploded. She did this. That witch did this. She froze everything. Ben turned toward her, furious. You said she wouldn't go that far. She was bluffing. She never bluffs. Megan stepped closer, lowering the phone just enough to meet her mother's eyes. Maybe it's time you stop underestimating her. Tracy looked like she might slap her. Megan didn't flinch. Later that evening, Caroline and Ruth sat on the shaded patio of a quiet French cafe tucked in the corner of a local plaza. The sun was starting to dip, casting long gold streaks across their table. Caroline stirred her iced tea. She hadn't touched her quiche. Ruth scrolled through Megan's recording, her grin wide enough to split her lipstick. Oh, they're unraveling. Caroline said nothing. Her expression was unreadable. You good? Ruth asked gently. Caroline nodded once. This was never about watching them squirm. This is about restoring what they stole and making sure they can't steal again. Ruth took a slow sip of her wine and leaned back. Well, that's the second flush then. Caroline gave the faintest smile. Not quite. Her phone buzzed. A text from Alan. Need to meet. Found something in the refinancing docs. It's bad. Caroline stared at the screen for a moment, the breeze lifting a few strands of her hair. Then she stood. I need to go. Ruth blinked. Everything okay? No, Caroline said, already dialing. But it will be. The emergency hearing was scheduled within 48 hours. Alan didn't want to give Ben time to cover his tracks. It was late afternoon when Caroline stepped into the familiar courtroom. the air staler now, heavier, as if the building itself anticipated confrontation. Tracy and Ben were already seated at the plaintiff's table, their expressions brittle. Tracy clutched her phone like a weapon. Ben, in a wrinkled dress shirt, avoided eye contact with everyone, including his attorney, who looked like she'd aged 10 years since their last hearing. Alan greeted Caroline with a nod and handed her a small stack of highlighted papers as they took their seats. "I'm only using the original refi packet and signature comparison today, enough to trigger a fraud review." "I trust you," she said, sliding her reading glasses onto her nose. "Let's show them what desperation looks like on paper." When Judge Rowe entered, his presence carried weight. His eyes scanned the docket as he spoke. "This is a motion for injunction filed by Caroline Myers, requesting a court-ordered investigation into potential financial fraud related to forged documents. Mr. Pierce?" Alan stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we've submitted into evidence a 2019 mortgage refinancing packet in which my client's signature was required. However, forensic review strongly indicates the signature was fabricated without her knowledge or consent." The judge leaned forward. "Fabricated how?" Alan opened a folder. "Here is Caroline Myers's actual signature across 7 years of verified documents. And here," he passed a blow-up across to the bench, "is the signature submitted with the 2019 refinancing package." Rose studied it carefully. The courtroom remained silent, tense. Alan continued, "Beyond the inconsistent slant and pen pressure, Your Honor, there's something simpler. The date of birth listed on the digital authorization form is incorrect. My client would not misspell her own middle name and forget the year her husband died. Both errors appear in the forged version." The judge turned the page, jaw tightening. "This was submitted to First Gulf Mortgage Bank?" "Yes, sir. Funds were dispersed to the borrowers within 2 weeks." Rose's gaze snapped to the other table. "Mr. Myers, care to explain how your mother-in-law's signature landed on a bank document without her knowing?" Ben's face went red, then pale. She said she'd handle the paperwork. I thought she signed it. We needed to move fast. It wasn't a big deal at the time." "Forgery isn't a clerical error," Rose snapped. "It's a felony." He looked to the clerk. "Prepare a judicial referral for criminal review. Freeze all impacted assets. Effective immediately." Tracy jolted upright. "Wait, what?" "No, Your Honor, I didn't sign anything. I didn't even know what he was doing." Ben's head whipped toward her. "Are you kidding me right now? You pushed for the refinance. I never told you to forge her signature. You were the one who wanted the damn kitchen remodel." They were unraveling right there in front of the judge, voices rising, fingers pointing. Even the stenographer paused typing, unsure whether to capture the chaos or let it speak for itself. Megan sat in the third row behind her grandmother, phone in her lap, eyes wide. She leaned closer to Caroline and whispered, "They're unraveling." Caroline didn't turn. "Let them." Judge Rowe banged his gavel. "If either of you speak again without being addressed, you will be held in contempt. I'm ordering an immediate financial audit, and I strongly suggest you hire separate counsel." Tracy's mascara was starting to run. Ruth, 2 seats over, whispered to Megan, "Watch them swirl." Megan let out the smallest laugh. It was the first time she'd smiled in days. By Friday, the world began to shrink for Tracy and Ben. The credit card companies were first. Impersonal emails stamped with words like suspended and risk review. Then came the phone calls. Long holds, hollow apologies. No one would confirm it outright, but someone had clearly pulled a lever. Their names were flagged. Their spending halted. By Monday morning, the repo truck came. Tracy stood in the driveway barefoot, robe flapping open over yesterday's leggings as a thick-set man in a blue jumpsuit clipped the lock off the steering wheel of her white Range Rover. The backup beeps echoed through the cul-de-sac like a funeral dirge. "That's our car!" she screamed, her voice half rage, half shock. "We're paying for that." The man didn't even look at her. "Not anymore, ma'am." Ben came stumbling out moments later, shirtless, with a folded chase statement in one hand. You can't just take it. This is a mistake. We've been customers for. The truck pulled away, slow and unbothered. The taillights disappeared behind the hedges. From across the street, a neighbor watering her begonias lowered her hose. Another jogger slowed as he passed, taking in the spectacle before returning to his stride. Whispers spread like humidity. Inside, the second car was already gone. The Tesla, the one Ben always bragged about investing in, had vanished from the garage sometime during the night. There was no warning, just a gap where pride used to park. Tracy sat on the kitchen floor for a long time that evening. The marble tile was cold, and the house, once filled with imported fixtures and glass sculptures, suddenly felt hollow, like a showroom after closing hours. Upstairs, Megan was packing her bags. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" Tracy demanded from the bottom of the stairs, mascara still smudged from the courthouse. "To someone who doesn't lie for sport," Megan said without looking down. "She poisoned you." "No," Megan said, zipping the last compartment of her duffel. "You did that." By the time Megan reached the curb, Caroline was waiting in the idling car. Megan tossed her bag in the back seat, got in without hesitation, and buckled her seatbelt like she belonged there. "Sure you're ready?" Caroline asked softly. "I've been ready since the dog food." Caroline gave her a quiet nod and pulled away from the curb as Tracy stood in the open doorway, arms crossed, too proud to beg but too broken to follow. That evening, Ruth arrived at Caroline's house with a bottle of red and a bakery box filled with lemon bars. The air inside was warmer, lived in. Megan's suitcase was already unpacked in the guest room, her laptop charging on the kitchen counter, as if she'd always been there. "They lost both cars?" Ruth said as she sliced into a lemon bar. "Repossession plus frozen lines of credit," Caroline confirmed. "The mortgage company's next." Ruth grinned, savoring the tart. "You've got them cornered." "They did this to themselves," Caroline said. "I just stopped protecting them from it." From the living room, Megan looked up from her homework. "You know what this is, right?" she asked. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "It's a lesson." Caroline smiled, genuinely, for once. "Exactly." Ruth lifted her glass. "To consequences, overdue and fully delivered." They clinked. The foreclosure auction was held in a county annex building. Low ceilings, fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of stale coffee that clung to the carpet. Folding chairs lined the back wall. A lectern faced a sparse crowd of real estate agents, small-time flippers, and a few bored legal assistants. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, but it was final. Caroline entered just before the proceedings began. She wore charcoal slacks, a linen blouse, and a simple strand of pearls. Not for effect, but because she dressed for herself. Megan walked beside her, calm and composed, a step behind, like silent support. Across the room, Tracy and Ben sat on opposite sides of the folding table, both looking haggard and unshowered. They didn't speak. Ben kept nervously jiggling his leg. Tracy stared straight ahead, as if willing the auction not to happen through sheer rage. A county clerk stepped up to the lectern. "Item 27 on the docket, parcel ID 064921. Primary residence currently occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Myers. Lionholder has opted for forced sale due to unpaid obligations and active fraud investigation. Minimum opening bid, $427,000. Ben's face went chalk white. Tracy gripped the edge of her chair like she might snap it in two. In the second row, Alan Pierce sat quietly with a woman in a gray skirt suit beside him. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. She was the trustee. Caroline hadn't entered the auction as herself. She had entered as a silent owner of a trust established 6 months prior, Emerald Maple Revocable Trust, with the legal power to purchase, manage, and absorb assets without disclosing beneficiary identity. One hand rose. Emerald Maple Trust bids $427,000. The room stilled. No one else bid. Ben's mouth opened slightly. "Wait. What's happening?" The clerk's gavel came down. "Sold." Tracy shot to her feet. "You can't do this." Her voice cracked, bouncing off the cheap walls. That's my house, our home. We lived there. We still live there. The clerk didn't respond. It wasn't his concern. The transfer paperwork had already begun. Ben sat frozen, lips moving without sound. Megan watched them from across the room, her arms folded, her face unreadable, but her lips curved upward just slightly. As they turned to leave, Ruth met them at the exit, iced coffee in one hand, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "Well," she said, nodding toward the screaming echo behind them, "now you own the throne." Caroline said nothing. She didn't need to. The deed said it for her. Outside, the Texas heat bore down hard. The courthouse parking lot shimmered. Reporters lingered on the sidewalk with cameras, some already aware of the Myers name due to public court filings. Caroline paused at the base of the steps. "Alan will file the eviction order this week," she said to Megan. "I know," Megan replied. "They'll fight it. They'll lose." Caroline turned toward her. "You understand what this means?" Megan nodded. "It means they finally get to live within their means." Ruth let out a low whistle. Girls getting sharper by the hour. From behind them, the courthouse doors slammed open. Tracy emerged, heels clacking across concrete. Her hair was wild, makeup melted. "You vindictive witch!" she screamed across the parking lot. "You stole our lives! You'll pay for this, you sick, bitter old—" Caroline didn't flinch. She turned, took Megan's hand, and stepped calmly into the car waiting at the curb. Ruth slid in behind them. Tracy stood frozen on the courthouse steps, chest heaving. Reporters were starting to aim their cameras at her instead. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was different. Smaller, quieter, lined with aging oak panels and frosted windows that barely filtered the Texas sun. This was probate court. Not the louder halls of civil litigation, but if anyone expected a gentler room, they hadn't met Judge Rowe on a day with inheritance disputes on the docket. Caroline sat with her hands folded on her lap, her posture graceful, unmoved. Megan sat beside her in a pressed blazer and ballet flats, the picture of composed readiness. Across the aisle, Tracy looked more brittle than ever. Her hair was flat, her eyes rimmed in exhaustion. Ben wasn't with her, likely advised to stay away after the fraud hearings. But her attorney sat close, flipping through a stack of estate papers with frantic energy, trying to salvage the unsalvageable. "Your Honor," Tracy's lawyer began, voice clipped but desperate. "My client is contesting the latest amendments to Caroline Myers's will. These revisions were made under emotional duress, amidst escalating family conflict. We believe undue influence." Alan stood without waiting to be prompted. "Respectfully, Your Honor, that's not only speculative, it's offensive." Rowe raised a brow. "Proceed." Alan walked calmly to the bench, holding a slim leather binder. "My client updated her estate plan 5 months ago. All changes were reviewed and notarized under independent legal supervision in accordance with Texas law. Her cognitive assessments were clear, her intentions precise. She named her granddaughter, Megan Myers, as sole heir. Not out of spite, but out of trust." He opened the binder and handed it to the clerk. "Within these pages you'll find notarized letters, digital time-stamped copies, and a letter of intent from Caroline herself, drafted long before any family conflict arose. It includes justification for every decision." Judge Rowe flipped through the pages slowly. His expression didn't change, but the silence that followed was deafening. Tracy burst forward in her seat. "She was manipulated. Megan has been living with her, feeding her lies, poisoning her mind." "Ms. Myers," the judge snapped, "you will not interrupt these proceedings again." "She left me with nothing." Rowe looked up from the binder. "You left yourself with nothing." Tracy froze, visibly swallowing her fury. "I find the documents valid and the estate plan legally binding," the judge declared. "The petition to contest is dismissed." The gavel struck once. Final. No room for plea. Tracy stood trembling, red blotches climbing up her neck. Her fists clenched. She didn't scream this time. She didn't throw accusations or storm out. She simply sat, shoulders slumped forward, mascara tracking down her cheekbones as silent tears fell. Megan turned to Caroline but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The quiet warmth in her eyes said enough. Caroline didn't react. Her face remained neutral, serene. But her fingers were tense where they rested on the armrest, as if holding back the weight of decades, betrayals, disappointments, a mother's aching grief. 2 days later, the city press received a carefully worded media release from a Houston-based nonprofit. The headline read, $100,000 donation honors compassionate heart of Tracy Myers, funds to open new wing at downtown women's shelter. A high-resolution photo accompanied it. A large check, framed, stamped with Emerald Maple Trust. In the caption, "This gift, donated in full from the foreclosure proceeds of a West Houston property, celebrates the enduring legacy of empathy and charity exemplified by Mrs. Tracy Myers." Tracy found out the way everyone else did, through her phone, just after sunset. As she sat alone in her now-rented condo, the walls bare, the light bulbs humming, she scrolled, and scrolled, and stared. She threw the phone across the room. It cracked against the wall but didn't shatter. She did. By the end of the week, the story had gone viral. It started with a quiet headline in the Houston Chronicle's community section. Then the local NBC affiliate picked it up. From there, it snowballed. Feeds flooded with headlines that straddled outrage and fascination. Heiress left out of will, but donated to homeless shelter in her name. Revenge or redemption? Caroline Myers and the 100K mystery. From designer bags to the breadline, what happened to Tracy Myers? Caroline didn't comment. She didn't need to. She'd never had social media, never wanted it, and didn't see the need to start now. But Megan did. And Megan knew exactly how to ride the current. She reposted the article with a single caption, "A donation worth more than any apology." It exploded. Tracy's inbox filled with hate mail. TikToks of influencers reenacting the dog food dinner surfaced under the hashtag #SON toilet lid justice. Her name trended on local message boards with phrases like entitled monster and karma couture. Ben didn't fare any better. A local watchdog blog posted a timeline of his fraudulent activity, complete with quotes from the ongoing audit and screenshots of the court docket. His LinkedIn profile was bombarded with comments until he took it down. By Thursday, the state licensing board issued an official inquiry into his real estate credentials. That same evening, Megan and Caroline sat on the sunroom couch, laptop open between them, watching the whole circus unfold. Megan tilted the screen. He just got removed from the board of that luxury condo project he used to brag about. Caroline didn't look. He was always over-leveraged. He just forgot gravity exists. From the kitchen, Ruth called out, "Channel 8's got her picture next to the check again. Bless their little hearts, using that smug gala photo from 2021. She walked in, holding a glass of sweet tea in one hand and a remote in the other. On the screen behind her, a grainy shot of Tracy speaking at a charity luncheon filled the frame. "The woman of the hour," the news anchor intoned, "whose name now graces a wing of the downtown shelter, but who hasn't said a word about the donation she allegedly didn't approve. Because admitting it would be admitting the whole story," Megan said. Caroline sat back in her chair, gaze resting on the window where the fading light softened the edges of everything. Let her be the face of something good, for once in her life. Ruth settled into the armchair beside her. "This isn't just a flush, honey. This is the whole system backing up on them. Justice, fully served." Caroline smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the window. "Only because I had people who helped me remember who I was." Megan reached for her hand. "You never forgot. You just got tired of reminding people." Silence settled comfortably between the three women. There was no celebration, no loud cheering, just a shared knowing. A quiet peace that had been earned, not given. Across town, Tracy sat in a booth at a second-rate diner, trying to keep her hood up as a server refilled her coffee. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the newest headline. The photo was particularly cruel, cropped close, catching the moment she screamed outside the courthouse. Someone had captioned it, "When your mom evicts you and makes you a charity icon." The laughter from the next booth over felt like knives. Her phone vibrated. Another block number. Another voicemail she wouldn't check. Ben hadn't come home the night before. He hadn't messaged since the licensing board opened its case. She was alone. Fully. Publicly. Alone. And her name was now affixed to a shelter wall where people who had truly lost everything would pass through and think she'd done something noble. The mugshot hit the internet just after 6 a.m. Ben's face, sallow, hollow-eyed, stubble creeping in over his once manicured jaw, flashed across the homepage of nearly every local news site in Houston. The caption beneath the grainy photo read, "Benjamin Myers booked on bank fraud and document forgery charges. Bail set at $250,000. It was the kind of picture no PR team could spin. His hair, once slicked back with product and pretense, hung limp over his forehead. His expression was caught somewhere between confusion and collapse. Megan found it first. She was on her laptop in the breakfast nook, hair still wet from a shower, when the alert pinged across her screen. "Grandma," she called, without looking away. "You might want to see this." Caroline walked in from the hallway, cup of black tea in hand. Ruth followed behind her, curious. Megan turned the screen toward them. Caroline set her cup down with precision, leaning slightly closer, eyes narrowing only a touch. "Well?" Ruth said, crossing her arms. "They finally snapped the right kind of picture." "State picked up the case?" Caroline asked. Megan nodded. "Yep." DA's office confirmed they're pursuing felony charges. He's going to lose his license for good. Caroline said nothing at first. She just stood there, hands folded over one another, letting the silence stretch long enough to feel the weight of it. Ruth placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's the final flush, darlin'." But Caroline wasn't smiling. Not yet. Elsewhere, Tracy sat curled in the corner of her borrowed couch in a friend of a friend's rental. Her phone buzzed endlessly from the kitchen table. She didn't check it. She knew what it was. Calls she wouldn't answer, reporters she couldn't dodge, high society contacts now looking for the exit. She had officially become toxic. No one invited her to brunch anymore. Her Pilates studio rescinded her locker key. Her name was struck from 2 social committees and a fundraising gala she once chaired. No one said it to her face, but Houston's social ladder didn't tolerate scandal unless it came with a redemption arc. And hers had been gifted to a shelter she didn't know existed. On the screen of her muted television, her ex-husband's mugshot lingered in the bottom left corner as a reporter recapped the charges in brisk, scandal-hardened tones. Tracy turned away. Her stomach roiled with shame, but it wasn't just from the headlines. It was from the silence, the absence of anyone rushing to her defense. The horror of realizing she wasn't feared or admired or envied. She was forgotten. Back at Caroline's house, sunlight poured through the living room windows. Megan sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a binder that Caroline had laid out beside her. A new version of the estate trust. Thinner now, clearer, more defined. "This section," Caroline said, pointing gently to the final tab, "gives you full discretion after my passing. Not just access, control." Megan looked up, stunned. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Caroline leaned back in her chair, the sunlight catching the silver in her hair. "You've watched what happens when people inherit without understanding the responsibility. I want better for you." Megan swallowed hard. "You showed them, you know. All of them." Caroline allowed herself the faintest smile. "I showed myself." Ruth appeared in the doorway, a tray of fresh scones in hand. "Tea and trust law. I knew I liked this house." They all laughed, a soft chorus of women who had survived fire and come out cleaner on the other side. Caroline looked toward the window again, thoughtful. The house was quiet that morning, not with tension, but with calm. The kind that settled over places that had been reclaimed, restored, and made sacred again. Caroline sat at the writing desk in her study, the same one where she'd balanced budgets, drafted birthday cards, and once cried silently over a pile of unpaid bills she couldn't fix for her daughter. But today, the space held no ghosts, only purpose. A single folder rested on the polished surface. Inside, the final iteration of her will. No contingencies, no room for contest. It had taken Alan weeks to refine, a fortress of language and legality. The trust was irrevocable now, its contents structured with clarity. Assets, property, equity, liquid holdings, all passed directly to Megan Myers, sole beneficiary and successor trustee. The house, the trust, the legacy, not inherited by default. Chosen. Caroline looked up as Megan entered the study. She paused in the doorway, notebook in one hand, uncertain. "Is this the last version?" she asked gently. Caroline nodded. "Yes. Alan filed a copy electronically this morning, but this one..." She tapped the folder. "This one is yours." Megan stepped forward, but her eyes were heavy with hesitation. "It feels like closing a book I don't want to end." "It's not an ending," Caroline said softly. "It's a transfer." The door creaked open again, and Ruth entered with her leather notary bag slung over her shoulder and a faint lipstick smudge on her coffee cup. "Well," Ruth said, clapping her hands once, "let's make it official before I start crying and mess up my stamp." Caroline smiled, gently, gratefully. She opened the folder and removed the signature page, then passed it across the desk. Megan watched as her grandmother signed, each pen stroke deliberate and calm. Then Ruth stepped in, stamping and signing with professional precision. "Witnessed," she said softly, sliding the document back toward Megan. Megan stared down at the ink, her name written into history. And then, finally, she looked at Caroline. Tears welled, but didn't fall. She reached across the desk, around the papers, and wrapped her arms around her grandmother. It wasn't a light hug. It was a grasp. Solid, grateful, real. Caroline held her close, one hand resting against the back of Megan's hair. "Now it's sealed," she whispered. Outside, wind stirred the trees in the front yard, rustling the leaves like soft applause. Later that afternoon, Caroline and Megan walked through the courthouse annex together, papers filed and clerk receipts in hand. The final documents had been recorded, processed, and verified. Judge Rowe had personally validated the trust execution via electronic hearing with a single sentence: "This is an airtight legacy." As they exited the building, sunlight glinted off the glass doors. Megan held the envelope of stamped documents close to her chest. "I thought I'd feel relieved," she said, "but it feels bigger than that." "It is," Caroline replied. "You're not just inheriting what I built. You're inheriting what I withheld. Every asset I didn't give to someone who tried to use me as their retirement plan." Megan smiled, but her eyes didn't leave her grandmother's. "Do you regret anything?" Caroline paused at the top of the courthouse steps. The sky stretched clear above them, a deep August blue. Her shoulders relaxed. She turned to Megan. "I regret how long it took me to stop giving people the benefit of the doubt when they'd already spent it." Then she reached out and took Megan's hand. "And I'm grateful I still had something left to give you." The sun had barely crested the rooftops when Ruth spotted the shape from the bay window. "Don't panic," she called from the kitchen. "But we have a kneeler on the porch." Caroline didn't look up from her tea. She'd known this day would come. People like Tracy always returned, not out of love, but out of scarcity. And shame had a way of breaking bones that even prison couldn't touch. Outside, Tracy was on her knees. Literally. Her hair was unwashed, yanked back into a lopsided ponytail. She wore leggings, the kind with thinning elastic, and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, sleeves pushed up past her elbows like she was trying to scrub something off her skin. "Please," she choked out, her voice raw with hours of crying. I have nowhere else to go. Caroline opened the front door slowly. She didn't step outside. She just looked down, her expression unreadable, her silhouette framed by calm. I'm sorry, Tracy said quickly. I was stupid. I was proud. I thought you were trying to hurt me, but you were right. About all of it. About Ben. About me. Her knees shifted against the brick step. She hadn't even brought a bag. I've lost everything. Everyone. Megan won't return my calls. Ben's in jail and probably going to prison, and I can't even afford my own phone bill next month. I messed up. I messed up. The porch was silent except for her quiet sobs. Across the street, a neighbor watering her begonias glanced over, then froze. 2 houses down, someone behind a drawn curtain watched the scene unfold like a stage play. Caroline stepped forward. She didn't kneel. She didn't crouch. She stood tall, steady. I warned you for years, she said, voice even. Every conversation, every refusal to set boundaries. I let you trample me. You didn't just take from me. You taught your husband how to do it better. I know, Tracy said, her hands trembling. I thought I had time to fix it. Caroline studied her face as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Not with rage, not with grief, but with clarity. Megan stood behind the screen door, phone in hand. She didn't speak. She didn't interfere. She just recorded. Silently, slowly, capturing the moment not for social media, but for memory, for history. You want forgiveness? Caroline asked quietly. Tracy nodded quickly. Yes. Please. God, yes. Caroline tilted her head. Forgiveness is free. Tracy looked up, startled. But money, Caroline added, eyes hardening just slightly, is not. And with that, she stepped back and gently closed the door. Tracy remained kneeling. Outside, the world didn't pause. A truck rumbled by. A dog barked in the distance. A sprinkler rotated across a front lawn like it hadn't just witnessed a generational collapse. Ruth appeared beside Megan, coffee in hand. Well, she murmured, glancing at the woman on the porch through the glass. Poetic, isn't it? Megan nodded, her voice quiet. It's like watching a queen beg at the castle gates she tried to burn down. Inside the study, Caroline returned to her desk. There was one envelope left on top of her filing stack. She opened it with deliberate calm and scanned the figures, the remainder of the foreclosure profit, untouched since the trust was executed. She didn't hesitate. She picked up her pen and wrote across the top of the statement in confident, looping script. Allocated to Emerald Maple Community Banking Grant, scholarships for local first-gen students. The account had already been drafted weeks ago. Quietly, without ceremony, partnered with the same credit union where she'd frozen the Myers accounts. The only difference was, this time the funds were building futures, not enabling illusions. That evening, Megan sat with Caroline on the back porch, legs tucked under her on the swing, crickets humming in the distance. You didn't have to do that, Megan said softly. You could have just walked away. Caroline stared out at the dusk settling over the trees. Walking away is what they expected. I'd rather leave a mark than a bruise. Megan leaned her head against Caroline's shoulder. You did. The first press mention wasn't front page. It came as a 3-column story in the Sunday Houston Sentinel under the Education and Equity section. Retired banker funds local scholarships for first-gen students. The photo was simple. Caroline in a navy blazer standing outside First Gulf Community Credit Union beside a brick sign that now bore a brass plaque. Emerald Maple Banking Access Fund. Megan stood next to her, holding a folder, her face steady but unmistakably proud. Caroline didn't smile for the camera. She didn't need to. The article described the $275,000 endowment in calm, clinical language. It listed her years in regional banking, her volunteer mentorships after retirement, the public financial ordeal she'd weathered, and the scholarship's unique focus, assisting low-income, first-generation college students pursuing degrees in finance, accounting, and risk management. She'd built a future-proof firewall, not against family, against forgetting. Inside Caroline's living room, the article lay open on the coffee table beneath a pair of reading glasses and a mug of slowly cooling tea. The phone buzzed softly nearby. Calls from reporters, university liaisons, community leaders, but she didn't answer. She just watched Megan across the room, hunched over a laptop, compiling applications. That one's from Sugarland, Megan murmured. First in her family to finish high school. Wants to work in credit unions. Caroline tilted her head. Highlight her. Let's bring her in for the first round. Ruth entered from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, catching the tail end of the exchange. Look at you two, she said, grinning. Powerhouse and protege. You've built a whole machine over here. We're just getting started, Megan replied, eyes still on the screen. You're not just getting started, Ruth said, turning toward Caroline. You've finished it. You cleaned it all out. Now you're building something no one can steal. Caroline exhaled, a slow and satisfying breath, like the release of years she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her eyes lingered on the brass plaque photo in the article again. For the first time in decades, the sum of her life wasn't being funneled into others' expectations. It was standing on its own interest. That afternoon, a small ceremony was held at the downtown campus of Houston Metro College. Nothing flashy. Folding chairs, one podium, sandwich trays and sugar cookies on a plastic-covered table. But the students showed up. 10 of them, all wide-eyed, half nervous, gripping letters that confirmed they'd received full tuition scholarships backed by a woman none of them had ever met. Caroline shook every hand personally. You belong in the rooms no one ever opens for people like us, she told a young man in a threadbare blazer. Make sure you hold the door open behind you. Megan sat on the stage beside the college president, officially introduced as trustee of the Emerald Maple Fund. She spoke briefly, gracious, poised, and pointed. My grandmother taught me the difference between access and inheritance. One gives you what others think you deserve. The other gives you what you're ready to build. These scholarships aren't charity, they're investments. Applause followed. Ruth dabbed at her eyes in the back row. No one mentioned Tracy. No one needed to. Back home, the porch was quiet. The begonias were blooming again. The whisper network of neighbors had long since shifted focus, from gossip to admiration. Caroline wasn't a curiosity anymore. She was a matriarch. She sat on the swing with Megan beside her, papers in hand, applicants, updates, correspondence. I think we should add financial literacy workshops to the grant next year, Megan said. Maybe a few internships? Make a list, Caroline replied, then paused. Better yet, make a budget. Megan smirked. You're still teaching me, huh? Caroline smiled, warm and soft. Always. The breeze picked up. A wind chime stirred overhead. Inside, Ruth hummed from the kitchen, the smell of lemon tea rising in waves. The table was real this time. Not a folding card table shoved into a corner. Not a restaurant booth blurred by obligation, but Caroline's solid walnut dining table, polished by age and use, centered beneath a soft brass chandelier. Real plates, real napkins, real food. Roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed sweet potatoes with toasted pecans. A salad so fresh it still held the smell of the backyard herb bed. And in the center, a bottle of wine. Ruth's favorite Malbec, already breathing in a decanter. Caroline moved slowly but deliberately, setting the final dish down herself. She wasn't rushing. There was no performance, no audience to impress. Only presence. Megan and Ruth sat across from her, both glowing in the soft golden light. Smells like a southern Christmas, Ruth said, draping her napkin over her lap. Only without the relatives I used to pray would get laryngitis. They laughed, full, open laughter that stretched toward the ceiling and didn't come back down in pieces. Megan poured the wine, her hands steady, her voice light. This feels right, Caroline nodded. It is. Outside, dusk had just begun its descent. Inside, time seemed to pause, like the universe had granted them one evening where nothing old could chase them, and nothing new needed to be built yet. As the meal unfolded, stories poured across the table like second helpings. Megan told a wild tale about a scholarship applicant who accidentally emailed his application to a seafood distributor. Ruth recounted the time she tried to stage a protest over coffee prices at a community board meeting and got accidentally elected chairwoman. Even Caroline let herself laugh, a slow, unpracticed sound, like a tune she hadn't whistled in years. Midway through dessert, pecan tartlets Ruth had baked earlier, Megan leaned forward, her voice quieting. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said to Caroline. "About what you withheld." Caroline tilted her head slightly, listening. "You didn't just leave me an inheritance," Megan continued. "You left me strength. I don't think I would have survived what you went through. But watching you, choosing power without cruelty, fire without spite, it changed something in me." The candlelight flickered across the silver edge of the plaque that now hung above the sideboard. It had been gifted to Caroline after the scholarship ceremony, Emerald Maple Fund, founded by Caroline Myers. Megan had hung it earlier that week without asking. Caroline's eyes lingered on it for a moment. Then she looked back at her granddaughter, her voice low. "You survived more than you know," she said gently. "You kept your soul in a family that traded theirs for status. You didn't just earn this trust, you earned your own." Megan blinked back a tear but didn't hide it. "That's the first time I've felt safe, like I'm not living in someone else's debt." "You're not," Caroline said. "Debt only holds power if you believe it still exists." Ruth raised her glass, leaning back in her chair. "I'll toast to that." They clinked glasses, the sound crisp and delicate. Outside the window, porch lights glowed in distant yards. Life moved on quietly. Cars rolling by, wind rustling leaves, a dog barking down the street. But inside the house, something had settled. Not silence, peace. Caroline looked around the table. Megan's laughter, Ruth's steady presence, the warmth of a home she had re-anchored with intention and grit. There was no audience to gloat to, no courtroom to win over, no final punch to throw. And yet, there was one truth left to speak. She glanced toward the plaque once more, then back to her glass of wine, swirling the dark liquid gently before she said, almost offhand, but with unmistakable precision, "They served me filth. I served them foreclosure, and flushed their future where it belonged."